So there's these pages from Ashita that are a little bit weird. I'd be lying if I said I ran into them and was never given pause when trying to parse how to read them. And I've seen a non-zero amount of other people get hung up on this exact section. You hit that first panel and you want to go right to left. That's how manga is read. But doing so will ask you to cross over to the second page not once, but 4 total times to complete the sequence. Not doing so means changing the read order on the next page over, going top to bottom instead of right to left. You'll also notice this breaks continuity. After the 7th panel on the first page, where Joe is punched, his head is more upturned. But going right to left has him dropping it back down only to raise it up again before he's actually been hit the second time. With the context in mind, we can judge that the correct order is like a 4-koma. Top to bottom for all the columns between the 2 pages. This is further corroborated by the following sequence where the commentators go over the footage again and see 2 flips and 2 punches, as opposed to the 4 flips and 2 punches we'd see going the other way. I don't think it's that strange of a misreading to make. Each set of 2 panels on the right is bunched together, with the vertical gutter being smaller than the horizontal ones. This is what Cohn, author of The Visual Language of Comics and a number of other academic texts regarding the reading of graphic novels, refers to as grouping, as readers are more likely to read panels that are closer to one another before crossing wider gutters or across to the other page. So yeah, just a little manga making oopsie, right? Well, that's the thing. This isn't some amateur artist, this is Tetsuya Chiba nearing the end of Ashita Joe, an already iconic series by this point. This is the only time in the whole manga that I ran into an issue like this. Wouldn't it be earlier in a serialization rather than later where oopsies happen, before the artist has found their style? And never mind the editor. It's their job to make sure the manga is readable and suited for the target audience. So we can point the finger at some skilled professionals making what is still one of my favorite manga, or maybe we can point the finger inward, look a little deeper, and wonder why all this is supposed to be a mistake at all. I've seen people talk about manga pages they have problems with when it comes to what Cohn calls assemblage, defined as a principle when the reader or author of a page layout seeks to build successive units of structure based on distance and coherence of composite shapes in as smooth a reading path as possible. We start at the upper right, and the way the panels are laid out takes us to the bottom left. A problem would be when a reader isn't sure what path to take through the page. You'd think that when a bunch of different people complain about the read order of a bunch of different pages, they'd be having equally diverse issues. But instead, the issues I see actually tend to what I think is the exact same problem. The same issue, time and time again, mentioned by different people on different series. As an English speaker, I would be obfuscating if I didn't mention that I'm purely referring to English online discourse, which means there's a few commonalities that have to be addressed. And the first one lies with the kind of manga page you might have seen in the first manga you've ever read, only to skip over it afterwards. This book reads right to left, Japanese style. Start reading from the top right panel and take it from there. It may seem backwards at first, but you'll get the hang of it. Have fun. Take it from there, huh? Doesn't really help that the example page has an exceptionally simple panel layout. This specific one is from a 7 Seas release. Viz doesn't offer much better. Dark Horse's Berserk release actually uses a page from the manga, but the description is just as lacking as the others because, well, taking it from there is exactly how we ran into the issue with those Joe pages. And it's not unique either. This one extra from Bakuan might read as a 4-koma, but that might be lost at a glance because the panels are in a grid rather than a column. This only stood out to me in the first place because the translator themselves admitted to being confused and included the correct read order. These mistakes are inevitable when the teaching tools are subpar. But now that we recognize the issue, we should ask, well, how do we know what the right way to read is? Is it even possible to do it without hindsight every time? That, I don't know. But at the very least, I'll say this is the fundamental mistake I see people making so often, including myself. And it's not that they read a 4-koma manga like a regular manga. In my observations, 4-koma manga aren't actually different. They follow the exact same rules as regular manga even despite their format. Where I think those earlier guides are unhelpful is that in saying manga is just like a comic, but read from right to left instead of left to right, is only half the picture. In comics, it's assumed that after we finish the page from left to right, we then go up to down. It's read much like a book, with lines of text, just done through the language of sequential art in the same direction. And perhaps from that description you might already be seeing where I'm going with this, because manga isn't actually read from top to bottom like that. Or rather, The right to left direction doesn't have an inherent priority over top to bottom. If I were to describe the primary difference between reading comics and reading manga, it would be that comics are read from left to right, then top to bottom. Manga is read from right to left, or top to bottom. And just like with comics, I believe it's for a similar reason. English is written from left to right, with following lines being below the first, where Japanese can be written in both directions. Read a tweet and it will actually be written in the same direction as an English sentence. But when reading a manga, it's in lines that are read from up to down, then right to left. That Japanese can be read from both directions is actually illustrated in a gag from Hidamari's sketch. Reading the sign as intended, from right to left, it says the name of the bathhouse, Masa no Yu. But the students, familiar with both ways to read, take it in the opposite direction and see the esteemed honorific of Sama applied to their friend Yuno. This has a lot of effect on how manga panels are arranged versus how comic panels are arranged, and I think it's most clear in grid panels, as defined by Cohn. Though they're called cross layouts in a blog post by Rachel Thorne that kickstarted my interest in the topic, one that focuses on the T-rule and how gutters guide reading direction. In English comics, the very orderly layout of equidistant, often equally sized panels laid out with crosses between them is actually really common. It's easy to envision, structured, and quick to scan under comic reading direction. But why is it that you much less often see it in manga? Well, because the reading direction isn't as clear-cut. To break down a normal page, we can take the gutters and divide it into blocks. Sure, we have 4 panels, but the page is divided into 2 halves. This top half is further divided into 2. So from the upper right we read the first panel, then we cross over the gutter to read the second half, starting with the top as top has priority. Then we move to the bottom half of the page. Older manga were made when rules weren't quite developed yet, so your older series might use the same visual language but in different ways. This page does happen to read like a backwards comic, but without a constructed imbalance in the page, we aren't actually given reading direction by the layout. Here we have one large panel on top, but the next block could be made one of 2 ways. Do we go up to down, or right to left? In Tezuka's case, luckily we can assume right to left, which would be correct going by panel context, but as discussed, Chiba had other ideas. Let's go to a more general pair of pages that's more complex to show how the same general rules still apply. From the largest gutters, we can quickly divide the page into thirds, forming 3 blocks. After the first one, we go to the second, the large panel being followed by 6 smaller ones. However, even without the gutter of the book separating right and left halves, or the fact that they're all reactions and the read order doesn't have to be too strict, the panels are still shaped to avoid the cross panels that can cause such confusion. So we know to read the right half, then the left one on the next page, before going further left to the final block from the top down. Whether we go left or down, on a normal manga page it's the gutters that are the guide. Note that this is not an inherent rule in Western comics. This Uncanny X-Men page threw me for a bit of a loop because I initially tried to read it like a backwards manga. If we treat it like the earlier One Piece and Fist of the North Star pages, the first block would be the upper 5 panels, further divided into right and left. However, this panel with Charles is not the second panel like it would be under manga, but the 4th, as the reader is expected to go left to right first, then down. When going against this order, down first then right, arrows are used to guide the reader in what would be a natural reading direction for manga, but is potentially more confusing in a comic because left to right is so dominant. As Rachel Thorne notes, gutter orientation is secondary to the left-right, then top-bottom read order in comics as opposed to manga where they are much more necessary to the assemblage of a given page. For this reason, grid layouts are pretty rare in modern manga. As a result, these rules have almost become invisible. Rachel Thorne even notes that Japanese readers and editors are aware of these rules intuitively, saying the page is confusing and suggesting alterations. But by looking at various examples, we can see how thorough these rules are. Here, the width of the gutters creates grouping that helps guide the reader the right way, though the repeated art through Saki's placement creates a rhythm that certainly helps. But just from the grouping alone, panels in each row closer together than their siblings in the column, we see that the page reads more closely to the earlier mistake in the Joe page, just as intended this time. As Neil Cohn discusses in the paper Navigating Comics, blocking and separation are the most important aspects when determining read order. Blocking is when panels are arranged to block T-intersections like you'll find on many manga pages through their orientation, whereas separation and grouping more relate to the width of the gutters. Thus the reason for my use of the word blocks to denote sections of a page earlier. At the risk of getting repetitive, I want to step away from the grid layouts and look at a few other pages I have saved up over the last couple of years. Kept because I thought they were interesting, had problems with them, or saw other people having problems with them. There are also ones that would cause issues if you tried to read them like backwards comics. This one can be particularly dense and chaotic at first glance, but on analysis it follows the expected rules perfectly. The cornerstone is this line right here in the middle that divides the two halves of the page. Once you split up left and right, reading the rest of the page is a no-brainer. Like the One Piece or Kanojo Kanojo examples earlier, it uses gutter width, or in this case lack thereof, to help guide the reader. Though dividing it up is still just as simple. The sister to the cross-shaped panel is the L panel, where one panel wraps around another. These involve breaking the rule about dividing the page into blocks, the reader needing to focus more on the composition of artwork or context to parse them. Many of them often have inconsequential bits tucked away on one side of the panel. But like certain grid-based examples, they can need focus to get through properly. I was given some pause on this one because the top panel is closer to the big panel on the left when you're supposed to go down. For another example, this one actually manages to turn the reader back around on the L-shaped panel through the artwork, with Hanamori facing back to the right. These two middle panels also help form a block that guides the reader to the next line of dialogue before moving down. Compare these examples to an actual Western comic. If this page were read like a manga, we might not know whether to go to the side or down, but because comics read left to right before up to down, we wouldn't run into any confusion about which way to go. While panels are very important to the assemblage, the rules can be bent through leading lines and text. Maybe we'll fly with the birds and speech bubble across before we turn back around. Maybe we'll follow the text and briefly read left to right before switching back again. Across two pages we can even start climbing from bottom to top for a brief moment. These core rules on how manga reading differ from comic reading are very well shown in older English releases where the pages were flipped. This page from Astro Boy is flipped to read from left to right, but the grouping guides us down even where we might be inclined to go left to right like a comic. But still, even with more unique cases, it's oftentimes that the panel assemblage will be important. Even though Overhaul partially obscures the gutter, his fingers serving as panel dividers of their own, that middle gutter is still the most important part of the page. We read the right half first, then the left half after following the hand up the arm to Overhaul himself. Being trapped by the overlying art and ignoring the panels and gutters is a recipe for disaster. Just following the art from Nico's head and speech bubble down on this one means skipping the whole left half of the page that's actually supposed to be read before you get to the bottom right speech bubble. I've noticed that more recent manga will often have little details to allow for proper reading direction to get around this limitation when it comes to having two possible ways to go from a given panel. Here's a page that might appear to have a grid layout at first glance, but the panel offset allows the reader to go through the page correctly without being tripped up. This cover page layers the page gutters to form guidelines, ensuring the reader goes in a proper order at a glance. But they often make sure the content of the panels doesn't negatively affect the flow of events. Reg gathers ingredients, and whichever way you read the four panels, there is no loss of information or context that can be caused by reading the panels out of order like in other examples. This page introduces 4 characters, but even shuffling them around doesn't affect how the page is read. Here's a page of expressions that keeps the most neutral one at the start, and the most exaggerated one at the end, so no matter which way you read, the punchline of the gag will always land last. For a more unusual example that still has its key placement in the same positions, here the last panel is in the lower left, but the rest of the panels can be read in any order. So there's no sense of confusion while the section can maintain its manji shape that's such a recurring image throughout Tokyo Revengers. A manga that uses grid layouts a lot is Komi-san, and I found this interesting as it used a variety of different methods to ensure it was as readable as possible. The first example starts with a more staggered panel to push its reader in a right-left direction, before the next 3 rows continue that through repetitive art with the placement of Komi in the background in the left panels, with slightly wider gutters between the rows to further avoid confusion on top of the right panels being wider, again pushing the reader leftward. The second example has repetitive art throughout the whole, and while we do have the gutters to push the right to left, then down order, the arrows at the intersections leave no room for misreading. Example 3 is a little odd, because the first 2 wider panels and the grouping would insinuate a right to left order, but the arrows take an end path over the usual reverse Z one, and the only particular reason I can think why might be Najumi's head. In the first 2 panels, it's turned to look at the right side of the page, and also set on the right side of the page. The upper left panel has Najumi looking left as the tension built up seems to be released, only for it to turn right again in the last panel to subvert the buildup, drawn in more detail at that. The right panels have right facing Najumi, the left panel to left facing Najimi, except in the last one that subverts its prior one before the next page when Najimi just breaks away from the structure and layout entirely to take things at their own pace. Our second to last example has the usual repetitive art and grouping, but uses the speech bubbles to bridge the gap over the gutter and force the reader right to left anyway. Lastly, we have another example that follows an end path, the grouping more like the Ashita no Joe example with right and left panels being closer than top to bottom, but with numbering in the corner guiding the reader's ultimate path anyway. Though this time I can't think of a reason why it's top to bottom rather than right to left, especially when the prior page has the first two panels of the sequence going right to left. Signposting may be blatant, but it can still be better to have it than not. Is this page an end path or a reverse Z? Even if you read all the dialogue, you'll have to entertain both possible orders to know it's an end path. The text on the raw page doesn't seem to be oriented in any particular way to guide this, but I can't read it yet, so hell if I know. Text in manga generally gets pretty interesting. Even in the individual panels, text bubbles still have to consider similar reading orders. Bubbles that are closer together should be read together, even if that takes you top to bottom rather than across. This generally won't be a big issue for the reader. The translators and typesetters, however, have to figure out how to get across the meaning of the work while also having the manga be readable in English. The text on this black clover page fits its bubbles, but admittedly most of the bubbles have a bunch of empty space with horizontal words rather than the original vertical ones. But trying to fill it might lead to a bunch of hyphenization, which doesn't always make for the smoothest reading experience when a 2-kanji surname is stretched to 10 Roman letters plus honorific. And even that is very much preferable to developing neck arthritis one manga at a time. Like many authors might take different approaches, translators may attempt to handle vertical text in their own way. This Holy Land page still reads from right to left with its brute-forced top-to-bottom text as a mean to avoid more redrawing, but this angelic layer bubble in the second panel goes from left to right, my brain hurting as I try to read it backwards while going from right to left even though I'm used to reading English and left to right as normal. Both examples serve as a reminder that English text is only to be read vertically in small, short words in all caps rather than whole-ass sentences, because it really isn't designed to work otherwise. But again, this is a concession that I understand. Redrawing, editing, and finding ways to work with the artwork can be an immensely difficult and time-consuming task. Kanji themselves are more complex than any letter, and going hard to make a Roman character look as interesting as a kanji isn't necessarily going to achieve the same effect regardless. However, there is one more issue with the written word that I'd like to discuss. Here's a pair of pages from Future State: The Next Batman, with Katana cutting through a number of armed soldiers. While interesting enough alone for its flow of action guiding the reader in an uncommon right-to-left direction, I want to note the language, or rather, where the text bubbles are and aren't. Following Katana on the first row, we go left to right past a few exclamations and grunts. On the second, the only text we have is the sound effects for her slashes, small and blended with the cuts themselves. The last 3 rows all have speech bubbles, but it's rows 3 and 4 that interest me the most. Katana cuts down from 3 to 4, the action we've been following for half the page now guiding us away from the context of the whole scene. Do we continue the page as we've been reading it, or follow Katana? Well, the answer is yes, continue. Based on context, we should hear the soldier's warning that Katana is above before she drops down. But it's the text that interests me because while no row is without text, the second and fourth rows where you read opposite typical reading direction, right to left, the text is minimal. Least so on the 5th row when the action slows down, but most on the rows where we're reading backwards. Why I think this is because of the relationship between language and comic, or manga, read direction. Cohn mentions that language has an influence on reading direction. But what this comic spread shows that manga can't is how, well, we're reading manga wrong. Reading a comic book page from left to right and reading text left to right is completely natural. This unusual page managing its balance by restricting its text when taken from right to left. But manga, when translated, must fundamentally go against this typical read direction as we go the wrong way when it comes to text while trying to go the right way in regards to reading direction. I don't know how much this specifically has an effect on our ability to parse assemblage or how that would be tested, but anecdotally I can suggest a possible effect that might result from reading manga as a non-Japanese speaker. In the essay Lost in Translation by Lera Boroditsky, she describes an experience where she'd give people from various cultures around the world pictures of a temporal change like aging or food being eaten, and asked for them to be put in order. Where English speakers oriented them from left to right, Hebrew speakers from right to left, the Porm Parawan Aborigine tribe in Australia, who navigate their world by cardinal directions, wouldn't orient them based on how they were sitting, but would orient them from east to west how the sun rises and falls no matter how they were facing. In a lot of ways, how our brains work is cultural. That we can read manga at all is a wonderful privilege in itself, but as someone who grew up learning to read and write English, a language read and written from left to right, I believe my brain fundamentally wants to go left and right. But if you read just as, if not more often, from top to bottom, it's within reason that your brain would naturally go in that direction as well. These Joe pages from earlier didn't read easily to me, but I can completely understand why Chiba, his editor, and countless other people likely didn't have an issue at all in reading a set of pages like their native language insinuates it would be read. But some people, such as Tezuka in his Western comic influence perhaps, might have felt differently, that dissonance leading to the eventual abandonment and later adaptation of the grid layouts. As for me, I think it was an easy mistake to make on this page of Chihaya Furu where I naturally tried to read the dialogue in the top left, even though the dialogue in the bottom right was meant to be read first. Chihaya looking towards the text that was crossing the border certainly didn't help, but that's not as much of an issue in the original with that vertical text, now further away from the border between panels. I don't think it's my fault, or anyone's. Doing something different with the typesetting would cause new problems in itself. Smaller text would have taken away from its importance on the page, and moving it further down the page would be obscuring the art and leaving a big blank spot at the top. Friction like this is the natural result of the cross-cultural engagement that is reading a graphic novel outside of its intended language. Translation is an art, and it's not merely about the meaning of the words, but even the text itself. When I approached this video, I was thinking heavily on rules and tendencies. If page like this, then it must be read like this, unless like that, and so on and so forth. However, in doing research for the video past the second revision, I found that even language isn't necessarily a suitable explanation for the differences in thinking between comics and manga or English and Japanese. Geography of Thought discusses some broad stroke differences between East and West as explored through Confucian and Greek philosophy. It was really interesting, and I think it's worth a read for any who engage in both Eastern and Western thought through, say, media, especially for those more on the Western side of things. But more specifically, one thing the book expresses is that Greeks and Westerners had more interesting categorization and straightforward systems of rules that might allow formal logic to master all, where Chinese thought took more stock in holistic systems and the greater effects of factors outside the individual moving part. This whole time I'd been trying to approach this friction by trying to devise and apply rules to categorize and differentiate manga and comics, when the larger holistic systems at play, language, culture, and now the reverberations of ancient philosophy, had other ideas. So I have a page from Tokyo Ghoul which is really interesting, because trying to follow the action from right to left is rough enough on the first page, but on the second you'd have to imagine Gil running backwards, even if Kaneki leaping and hitting a wall makes a little sense based on the way he's facing. But on the previous page we see Banjo and the Gourmet standing behind Kaneki and Gil at the start. As for why the page flows this way in its own context, I'd suggest the relation between reading direction and Kaneki, our protagonist, who faces the direction we read from beginning to end. Kaneki is hesitant to fight, so Gil pushing the reading direction the opposite way puts Kaneki on the back foot in the direct fight. But we keep his perspective as the ground is only ceded because he gives it up in the moment, easily winning on the following page. But fundamentally, to look at this page under the Western desire to follow rules and logic, turning a page to start reading on the opposite side is like, when have you ever turned the page in a book and suddenly all the words are on columns and you're supposed to read up to down? Like, it's not something I've ever seen in a comic or even another manga. Almost, I'll get to that in a second. Call Ishida Sui experimental, call him a hack. I think he offers some unique and interesting page layouts that can enhance the context of the scene, even if the drawback is momentary confusion. Like here where the speech bubble bridges the gap down, when the arrangement of panel grouping makes that left-right oriented brain of mine want to go left instead. This kind of gets at exactly what Rachel Thorne talks about, with how the necessity of the T-rule and the lack of free ability to use panels in a grid sacrifice flexibility for efficiency, since reading manga is faster with the assemblage so cleanly guiding you through the average page. Ishida Sui, in trying to be flexible, sacrifices some of that clean readability. And rather than admonish him for throwing rules out, I'll once again point out geography of thought. That holistic thinking is important too. Think of the page not purely through the expected rules, but how it appears on the whole. The closest page I've seen to that being Nikaido Hell Golf, where reading from right to left means Nikaido undoes his golf swing, something that didn't quite make sense to me with the context of the first 25 chapters alone. I thought that his desire to try again meant he was indeed making another swing, and was thinking this page too was meant to be read left to right. But it was only after reassessing it with context from later chapters did I realize that, yes, this page is meant to be read as him doing his swing in reverse, for reasons I don't want to spoil. Just read it, it's good. It was a weird circular journey of mine that served as a good reminder that there's always new things to learn and discover. But wait! There's more! If the individual manga I've been discussing is the micro, the most individual scale between reader and author, and the discussion of language and cultural philosophies informing how these stories are drawn and then read is the macro, there is a bit of a tangent I want to go on regarding something in the middle. Medium. Thus far you've seen a lot of single pages with those 2-page spreads. In fact, if you're like me, then you've probably read a lot of manga online, which has often meant seeing manga in single pages, as a symptom of the fanbase springing up through digital means. But what's key to remember here is that this isn't how the medium is meant to be read. If you've ever used sites like MangaStream or One Manga, they force the reader to go one page at a time, and using Tachiyomi or its forks will put the reader in the same situation on their phones. But manga is made to be read 2 pages at a time, and the online reader base has been so accustomed to reading it otherwise that the limited options for reading 2 pages at a time is staggering. 2-page reading to my knowledge is limited to physical releases, some official manga apps like Viz in the browser version, Mangadex, and image viewers like Honeyview. Viz's selection is limited to their digital archives, where using something like Honeyview or Mangadex you'd need to do a page offset to fix the time when the pages are misaligned. If you can tell. It's frustrating reading fan releases for a series like Kingdom, where it's difficult for me to discern which page is on the left and which is meant to be on the right, because the gutters that would be in the middle have been trimmed out. Why this fact becomes important for manga paneling is that reading a digital version of a physical manga lacks the gutter of the book, which in itself is part of the medium and how pages are laid out. Digitally, the uncentered speech bubble looks awkward, but this is just a digital copy of a physical release, and physically the text needs to be exactly where it is to be readable for anyone who purchased the book. Here's a couple similar layouts that would run into that issue if not for the page gutters. This Astro Boy page goes from left to right, starting with one large panel going across both pages, which might lead to a reader wanting to read the next 2 rows the same way, from left to right. The crossed gutters do give a slight indication through their different widths, but even more important is the invisible third gutter belonging to the magazine and volume it was published in. With that in mind, we can see how the page is meant to be read, starting with the large panel, then the left page, followed by the right. This similar page from an older Fukumoto manga is actually read the same way, with 2 differences. The first is the gutters. The 2 lines in the cross are actually equidistant, so without the third gutter from the book we can't tell where to go on that alone. The second is that the page is structured so that the first half is internally spoken by the main character Tenma, where the second half is all his antagonist, Satsuma, dividing these 2 pages like so even if they start with one massive single panel. Here's one with a long panel in the middle. Without the book's gutter, we might want to go over here to the left. But as the left half of the panel is largely negative space, we aren't drawn to the second page until after finishing the first, even though the art extends over. And all of this is impacted when cropped on a phone. As much as I do enjoy reading manga on a phone for convenience, physically having to slide my screen back and forth to properly read many a 2-page spread is a concession I have to make by reading the medium in a way that's less than ideal. It's made worse when further reading as unintended by, say, reading a Viz release on Tachiyomi. Normally you'll see a full spread which zooms in on the first page, but Viz releases cut the spreads in half, which makes sense for their platform, but occasionally leads to me getting confused when I read what I think is one page only to scroll over and see a second with context I missed. Reading manga or comics with cropped pages is like driving with covers on your side windows. Sure, you can kinda see where you're going, but you're gonna run into something one way or another. But it's no surprise that this is seen as completely normal when early manga scanlation lived on websites that gave you one page at a time in a wide browser window, so you'd have to scroll up and down the page and be left vulnerable to any weird quirks of the page that occur by cropping it. I know I've had issues trying to use the Viz browser reader, but I'd still vastly prefer that to a 15 to 20 year history of fan translators and their digital platforms having treated manga like webcomics from day one. I want to start off the conclusion by stressing that, while I'm drawing from other sources, my research for the video didn't give me very clear answers, and as a result this video is largely anecdotal. My intent less to offer concise answers that in actuality would need more research and dissection, but rather to help give people like myself, readers of manga who come from English-speaking spheres, tools to better understand the process of reading manga in a language it wasn't meant to be read in. I love manga and that's not about to change, but that love also needs an understanding of the concessions I'm making by reading it, usually digitally, be it a phone or computer, and always in English.
Hello everyone! How are you? Fine, thank you.
Translation can't completely make the native language invisible, as its effect on the medium is so much deeper than words on the page. And hopefully this video helps make it more visible even when reading those many translations. If we take a purist approach, then yes, we're basically always reading manga wrong. If it's on a phone, it's wrong. If it's in English, it's wrong. If it's in smaller black and white volumes with no color pages, it's wrong. If it's in magazine scans without art or dialogue corrections, then it's probably still wrong. If it's not some fat release with big pages and all the color it was printed on, it's wrong. You're wrong, I'm wrong, everyone's wrong, everything's wrong. So please, read manga however you prefer. Read it digitally, where you have to mentally fill in the book gutters. Read it on websites that only give you 1 page at a time or put it in long strips even though it should have 2 pages at a time. Read it on your phones where 2-page spreads are a pain in the dick and you're gonna have to crop and zoom eventually. Read it in volumes that are a fraction of the size of the original print, and with its wonderful color pages dulled to splotches of black and white. Or read it in English where you're going the wrong way from the word go because the individual words are left to right, which every one of those guides earlier says isn't the way to read manga. But above all, read on, read a lot, and read well.